Good morning, buenos dias. My name is Marisola Viña, Director of Public Affairs at the California Endowment. Thank you for joining us today for our last Policy Perspectives webinar of this year. 2024 elections, what is next for equity and justice in California? Policy Perspectives is a virtual space where we gather to discuss state and federal issues that impact our state and our communities. As we know, elections have a very significant impact on our lives, communities, our state, and our ability to advance equity and justice in California. And we're going to talk about all of that today. We're all feeling and holding a lot, and I want to acknowledge that as we are arriving into this space this morning. Today's webinar is intended to provide what we hope is helpful information about the results of the election. While a lot of attention has been placed on the national elections, there were several state ballot initiatives here in California and legislative changes and some developments that are happening as we speak, and we will discuss all of this during today's webinar. We have a fantastic panel that will be sharing some insights on early voter trends and the electorate, what the results of the 2024 election mean for California, and how potential changes to state and federal policies will impact the lives of Californians. I will note that ballots are still being counted, and therefore our presenters will provide insights on what we know as of today. Before we get started, I also want to remind our audience that the Policy Perspective webinars are nonpartisan and non-political, and they're purely informational sessions. So today we first will hear from Dr. Mindy Romero, who is the founder and director of the Center for Inclusive Democracy at the University of Southern California's Sol Price School of Public Policy here in Sacramento. She's also a research assistant professor, and her research focuses on political behavior and race and ethnicity and political underrepresentation, particularly among youth and communities of color in California and in the United States. Dr. Romero will provide insights on what we know at this moment in time about voter trends and the electorate in this past election. She will then be followed by Michael Tora, managing principal at Raven, and he will provide an overview of the federal election results, again, what we know today, and the implications on the policy landscape in DC. And then last, but certainly not least, we'll have Marvin Pineda, who's the Director of Legislative and Regulatory Affairs at California Advocacy, and he will focus on the California legislative elections and ballot initiatives and what might be on the horizon here in the state. After the presentations, we will invite everyone back on screen to answer your questions. So we encourage you all to engage in the conversation, posting questions in the chat, as we will have an opportunity at the end of the presentations to answer those questions. We also want to appreciate those of you that submitted questions ahead of time because they helped shape the conversation today, and we will get to some of those questions also at the end of the webinar. A reminder, the webinar will be recorded and will be made available along with the slides, speaker bios, and other resources after the event. All right, so let's get started, and I now would like to welcome Dr. Mindy Romero to the virtual stage. Over to you, Mindy.
Good. Thank you very much for the introduction. Hello, everyone. I want to thank the endowment and everyone that's been part of putting this event together for inviting me and allowing me to participate. And I also want to thank, thank all of you for attending, particularly while everybody is holding so much in this space. And I hope everyone is doing well. I'm going to go ahead and start my presentation. I've been asked to talk about turnout in California. And as it potentially may relate, obviously, to policy and policy outcomes, policy change in the state. As already noted, turnout, we're in the process of counting ballots. Right now, we've counted about 10 million ballots. Back in 2020, in total, we had 17 million ballots, and it did take a very long time to finish counting all of those. We don't know if we're going to get quite up to 17 million, but we have millions more ballots to count, and more ballots that are still arriving that can legally arrive and be counted if they arrive at a local elections office by 7 days after the election day itself, if they've been postmarked. So that noted, let me jump in. Next slide, please. So I'll talk a little bit about the national context, as I know we're all thinking about it, but also, of course, it has implications for California. Then I'll look at the early turnout, say results, but for the most part, really just trends, as we understand that there are going to be changes, not just in total numbers, but even in the shape of the electorate and potentially in the shape or in the decisiveness, right, or the actual outcome of a proposition, for instance, because we know that there are demographic differences in those who vote early and vote by mail and by geography and so forth. And then lastly, I'm talking about building power, right, the topic today. I'm going to highlight some significant opportunities for voter mobilization in California that were present in 2024 and certainly going forward. Next slide, please. But first, I just want to note, I'd be remiss in doing so if I didn't, that when we're talking about a multiracial democracy, it requires inclusive, reliable data. And sources for voter data are limited. The two main sources for data, and I'm just going to talk briefly here on this topic, but are limited. They are largely the current population survey, which is a product of the census, which is indeed a survey. The November supplement will ask questions on turnout, registration, and so forth. And then we have official state and county voter files. When we want to do an analysis, there's methodological limitations, or at least challenges with the CPS, current population survey data. But when we want to do a sub-state analysis, we must look and use county and state voter files, because CPS data are not really reliable in California at a sub-state level for the most part. When we use official county voter files, the vast majority of voters that are in those files do not volunteer their race or ethnicity. We are a volunteer state when it comes to that information. And so researchers need to conduct what we call imputation. I won't get into what that is today. Happy to talk about in the Q&A if somebody for some reason is interested. But basically, we're statistically guessing on somebody's race or ethnicity through a variety of methods. And we assign them based on a certain level of probability, we assign them a race or ethnicity. And it is pretty reliable for some groups, less reliable for others. Notably, for Black voters, it's less reliable, and it's really challenging for very small population groups like Indigenous voters. And the bottom line is you'll see a very limited set of research in California examining race, ethnicity, or at least the breakout, the types of groups that are discussed because of those methodological challenges. And for researchers, it's a do no harm, right? We want to make sure that the data that we present is accurate, reliable, that people aren't misassigned, that we aren't misidentifying Black for white, for instance, or vice versa. Next slide. All right, so national context. Next slide, please. So let's just talk about turnout itself. So if you didn't know, in 2020 at the national level, we saw a record turnout. It was the highest since we've collected these records, comparable records. It was about 2/3 of eligible voters, those are adult citizens, who actually voted. Now, I think many of us will say 2/3 it should be higher if it's a record. But that's where we were at, was 67%. And of course, turnout's much lower in midterm years and in primaries. In California, officially for the Secretary of State's office, we were about 70% for eligible turnout. CID's numbers about 67, but still, officially, we were the highest, not as a record, but the highest that we saw in California for turnout in decades. So it was a very good year for turnout in California as well. Where are we in 2024? Well, according to the U.S. Election Project, we're at about 64.2% turnout of eligible voters. And again, adult citizens largely. And their calculations are a little bit, they have more voters thus far than, for instance, if you look at most of the networks, it's about 158 million, still counting. I don't know if we're going to get up to 67. Been a lot of speculation whether we'd reach that record number or break the record. But we are still counting ballots, right? In California, there's no way that I could give you that number because we are a vote by mail state, largely. In-person voting is very, very important, but it's a small percent. We have so many vote by mail ballots to count. Currently, we're about 45%, according to the Secretary of State's office, for registered voter turnout, which would be lower for eligible voter turnout, as the denominator is wider, right, for adult citizens. So I can't give you that number, and I caution all day yesterday, cautioning a lot of media, right, from reporting those numbers because they will change significantly. But we've heard at a national level how polarized we are. We've heard this all along, but particularly yesterday, right, noting, and we saw this in 2020, we saw it in 2016, a really dominant conversation, kind of noting that half the country as you've heard yourselves, I'm sure, supports a candidate whom the other half finds viscerally unacceptable, right? We're lamenting and deeply disappointed in this reality. Next slide, please. Let me show you some data, though. So these are exit polls at the national level, and exit polls have their methodological challenges as well. Happy to talk about that in the Q&A, but they're the data that we have. These will get adjusted and get tweaked some. But what we see here in terms of support for Harris and Trump, there is a big racial and ethnic divide. I could show you all sorts of breakouts demographically. We're talking about a multiracial democracy, so I'll focus on race ethnicity here. But you can see, according to the national exit polls, Trump is at 57%. This is as of yesterday. Again, these will get tweaked. For white, 41% for Harris, right, for white voters. This is not turnout. This is of those that turned out for each group, what proportion they said, right, they voted, who they said they voted for, the proportions. But when we look at Black, Latino, and Asian, we see a majority over majority, right, for Harris. Yes, that number for Latino has shifted more towards Trump, for 52 versus 46. Again, we'll have to see what the final numbers look like. But still, all three groups here, there's a split between white, Black, Asian, and Latino in terms of support for Trump versus Harris. Next. But a missing critical factor in this kind of discussion about half America feels this way or half America voted that way, of course, are the roughly 80 to 90 million Americans eligible to vote, adult citizens, who didn't turn out. And if we add these numbers into the mix, it's actually really roughly, and again, these are rough numbers, they're still counting, but roughly about a third for each candidate, right? Each candidate got about roughly a third of the country's eligible voters, 30 to 35, 33%, we think in the end. So it's not half, right? And we know that that the group of those that don't vote in the United States, eligible but non-voters, and in California as well, are not representative of the overall population of the nation or of the state. Next slide, please. And that has policy implications. So there are significant disparities in turnout. And again, we will not know the turnout rates by race ethnicity for quite a while until that research comes out. But there are significant disparities that are entrenched in our electoral system. We know they are going to be here again in 2024 when we have the final numbers. So voters of color vote in much lower numbers than white voters, for instance. Again, we could be looking at age, younger versus older, income higher versus lower. But disparities are entrenched. And turnout disparities produce that non-representative voting electorate. So the pie of voters that actually cast a ballot and make a decision, in this case, for president, or make a decision for all of the important races here in California, do not look like the overall eligible voter population, right? It's generally older, wealthier, whiter. And that has implications for policy. Why? Because we know from much research that there can be differences in policy preferences between the group of voters that we have in the United States and those who don't vote or typically don't vote, particularly on economic issues. Next slide. So what about California? Let's take a deeper dive now. Next slide, please. And I say early look at the results. Again, it's really the trends, but next slide. So here, for what we have thus far, right, 10 million ballots, many more to be counted. There's going to be no surprise. We knew Harris was going to win California. We are a deep blue state. Right now, as of last night from the Secretary of State's office, it's 57 Harris, 40 for Trump. And you'll see, though, that really it's a coastal inland story, right? Whole swaths of the state are voting for Trump, and in the end will, as the numbers are finalized. We know that there is quite a large difference by county in terms of Trump versus Harris, or Democrat versus Republican support at the presidential level. Next slide. Switching quickly here over here to the very important propositions that have already been noted. We've had 10 on the ballot this year, 5 citizens initiatives, 5 constitutional amendments placed on the ballot by the state legislature. Ballots are all being counted here, of course. Still, we know 36 has already been projected. I believe 3 is expected to pass as well. But out of all these 10, all of them are trending right to pass, except the bonds for affordable housing infrastructure, eliminating forced labor for inmates, raising the minimum wage in California to $18 an hour, and then the local government changing or lifting the restrictions for local government on rent control laws. Next slide. So for just some of these, I want to give you a sense, because we're talking about policy today, right? And we want to understand not just Republican Democratic split, but policy preference, differences in policy preference across our state that don't always align and often don't align with the dominant party in a given county, right? Voters can vote differently. There's a difference between registration, certainly, and even who you might vote for with an R or a D typically is an incredibly strong indicator. But beyond elected officials, when we talk about policies, there can be differences, and California has a long history of that. So here on Proposition 2, that's a school bond. Again, thus far, you can see some variation across the state in the counties that are for and against. Next. Proposition 3, this is a Marriage Equality Act, right? This is cleaning up the language in our state constitution that's left over from Prop 8 back in 2008. This is a man and a woman, or what is recognized as a marriage. This is to remove that. And yes, it is passing, and is, I think, expected to pass, but you can see very big differences across the state, whole swaths of the Central Valley and North State, where it is failing. Next slide. Prop 6. Also, big differences here. Here, this is failing overall for the state, but differences, I guess, in some counties, in LA most notably. Next slide. 32, raising the minimum wage. Again, it's failing, but you can see there's some differences, but actually not that many differences, right? So the vast majority geographically of the state, with the exception of LA County. And by the way, LA County, the range last I saw was only about 5 percentage points between yes and no. So fairly close in LA County too. Next slide. 36. This is about reassigning some theft crimes and drug crimes back to felonies, and stiffening sentencing requirements as well. You can see across the board in every county thus far, as we were counting ballots, every county wants to see this. This has strong support, period, in California. Next slide. Now let's talk about those party affiliation shifts. As I've already noted, there isn't necessarily party affiliation by how you might vote in an individual election, even for a candidate, can be different, but they tell us a lot. Next slide, please. So here, just really quickly, we're just going to focus on the blue. This is the share of the presidential vote in each of these elections that was Democrat. You can see in 92 and 96, if you're wondering who those other candidates are, that's Ross Perot. But if I just go across the line, starting at 92, it's 46, 51, 53, 54, 61, 60, 61, 63 in 2020. I don't know if Harris, who's currently at 57, if she's going to get that high. We could see lower numbers for Harris. We'll see. Next slide. This graph just says the same thing, visualizes it in a different way. Next slide. And here is party affiliation by race ethnicity in California. There's been a lot of conversation about shifts. If you look at the far right, we do see changes over time. Most recently, an increase in the registration proportion of our registered voters that is Democrat. On the far left is Asian American. In the middle is Latino. And for time, I'm just going to note that, yes, in the last couple of years, we've seen a slight change in registration for Latinos for Democrats, and a slight shift for Asian Americans for Republicans. Very, very small. Next slide, because I know I'm almost out of time. And this shows you just recently, 2020, 2022, our specific analysis at CID, some of the differences. And most notably here is that small shift, again, about a percentage point from 2020 to 22 for Latinos in Republican registration. But you might see here on the far right, we include white, and you actually see a slight decrease in Republican registration for white. Next slide. Now, LA County, if they'll indulge me for a moment, I want to just talk a moment about a tool that we have that allows you to do analysis right now in real time by race, ethnicity, and all dozens of different data demographic groups that might interest you. This tool tracks in real time through the early voting period, on election day, hourly, and every day after election day. We are updating turnout by precinct and vote center. Next slide. just really quickly. Right now, turnout in LA County, registered voter turnout is about 46%. We show tons of data here, but again, I'm just going to focus on low to high turnout communities. But next slide. You can see here, just looking broadly, the lighter shades of the lower turnout thus far. All of this is going to get darker, but we know the story is going to stay about the same, unfortunately. So the coastal areas, the northern suburbs, the hills, higher turnout. Lightest turnout, lowest turnout is in the urban core. Next slide. This is just zooming in. This will go actually down to the block level, and you can see neighborhood blocks, but this just gives you some sense kind of in between. You can see the lower turnout areas currently are Bell Gardens, Bellflower, Inglewood, Compton, Huntington Park, for example. Next slide. If we overlay demographics, so this one here with the boundaries are just showing you the communities a little bit better. Next slide. This is the percent of each community that is Latino. You can see the darker shades are the more dominant in terms of proportion that are Latino. These are the same communities that are currently running lower turnout and will end up having lower turnout, comparatively speaking, in LA County. Next slide. This is Asian American. Right, first thing you'll notice, the distribution of the Asian American population in LA is a little different, right? Larger shares of Asian American in the southern and eastern parts of the county. And of course, variation can be quite significant by subgroup. Our tool, you can look at population distribution by Asian American subgroup, by Latino subgroup. So I invite you to do that for time. I can't get into it today. Next slide. And here, this is the distribution of the Black population in LA County along that Inglewood, Compton corridor, if you will. This also overlaps quite significantly with those lower turnout areas that I showed you in our real-time tool. Next slide. And this is the white population in LA County. That whole urban core that had lower turnout that you noticed earlier has very small percentages of white voters in LA County. And white voters overwhelmingly are along the coast and the hills and in the northern suburbs. Next slide. Okay, I included some data about congressional districts, but I know my next colleague in line is going to talk about congressional districts. So I just kind of left this here for you to know that we have lots of detailed data on demographics. Go ahead and skip through to keep going. It gives you can get a sense of some of the demographic data that's available. Oh, go back to building power. Okay, so just quickly on significant opportunities. Next slide, please. So there are disparities in voter turnout in elections in California, U.S. in California, and by county, and by really any geographic area that you look. Of course, persistent voter registration gaps. But I also like to flip the story. We talk about all of those voters who are eligible, right, that are not voting. That is a disparity story and a less representation story. But it also means that there are a lot of eligible voters that could vote and could be mobilized. And in 2020, it was about 5 million Latino and Asian American voters alone who were eligible to vote, who didn't vote, that could be mobilized. Next slide. And of course, all of these voters represent different communities, different experiences, different ideas, different political affiliations, different policy preferences, but there are considerable opportunities to mobilize them. Next slide. And greater, more sustained investments are needed, not just in 2024, but really the long game to really build greater connection to the political process and to more greatly understand the differences in policy preferences, right, for mobilization and outreach purposes. And of course, also understanding the inequitable outreach landscape that we have from candidates and campaigns that don't reach out to voters of color or other historically underrepresented groups as much, even in consequential elections. That in tandem with historic and current policies that have created barriers to make it more difficult or can make it more difficult for historically underrepresented groups, for voters of color. All of this has significant policy and community outcomes in that we see a perpetuation of that underrepresentation in our electorate. Next slide, and I'm done. Thank you very much. Oh, and I'll turn it over to my colleague, Michael. My apologies.
Thank you, Dr. Romero. That was really fascinating. I could, and it's impressive how much information you already have, considering the election just happened. So thank you. I would want to listen to you, I think, all day long. So let me. I'm going to just walk us through sort of the federal results. I think you all know the very big one, of course, about the presidency. I'm going to kind of walk through some of the others and then what the policy implications are going to be of this. So we can go to the next slide in terms of how the U.S. Senate is shaping up. The current outgoing Senate has a small Democratic majority that includes 4 independents. What it's looking like now after the election, and we actually had one change after I made the slide, you'll see already 52 races called for, only a third of the Senate is up, right, every 2 years. So if you take into account those Republican senators that were not up for reelection, plus those that were and the races that have already been called, we're looking at 52 seats. It could go up to 53. The pink and light blue races are ones that haven't been called yet. And actually one of those pink ones is actually flipped to light blue now and maybe solid blue by the end of the day. So we're probably looking at maybe a 53-47 split in the Senate. The Republicans in the Senate will be choosing a new majority leader because Mitch McConnell is stepping down. It's going to be either John Cornyn of Texas or John Thune from North Dakota. Let's go on to the next slide to look at the House. The current House, there was a slim Republican majority, 220 seats, so the Democrats 212. There are currently 3 vacancies. But now, based on the election results so far, it's not final. A lot of races, especially in California, but also Oregon, Arizona, Nevada, have yet to be called. But it is looking like we're most likely going to have a Republican majority again, still a slim one, probably a net pickup for Republicans of 2 seats, though that might shift by 1 or 2 seats. It takes 218 to have a majority. So it does look like we're going to have Republican majorities in both the Senate and in the House, which is known as a trifecta. So let's look at how this is shaking out within the California delegation. Currently the split is 40 Democrats to 12 Republicans. Again, we've got still a lot of votes to count in California, so it's just very provisional. The light blue and the pink numbers are just those where either party is currently leading in the vote count, but it could still flip the other way. But if this were to hold, we'd be looking at 13 Republicans to 39 Democrats, so a shift of 1 seat towards the Republicans. So we also have had a number of retirements in the California delegation, right? So there's several open seats, and a number of those races have already been decided. So let's go to the next slide just to see some of the faces in the California delegation. First of all, Adam Schiff, of course, he is not new to the California congressional delegation, but he moves from the House to the Senate. He handily won the open Senate seat race. And then in the House, we've got 4 declared winners so far in open seats. Sam Liccardo up in San Jose area, and then down in LA County, Luz Maria Rivas takes a seat that previously was held by Tony Cardenas. Laura Friedman takes Adam Schiff's old seat. And then Gil Cisneros takes the seat that Grace Napolitano previously held. And then in the following 2 slides, I don't go through all these names. So we've got, 10, we have potentially 10 new faces coming, at least for 2 because they're open races. So in the Bay Area, Latifah Simon or Jennifer Tran. And then we've got, these other races that are still too close to call. On the next slide, I'll just note, a lot of races where incumbents are being challenged, but 1 open seat down in Orange County, you've got Dave Min and Scott Baugh vying for that seat. Scott Baugh's ahead a little bit right now. So that's where we are with the delegation. So what is this all going to mean now when it comes to policy? And maybe we can just take down the slides for a moment while I just provide a bit of context before we go to the next slide. so you're going to have now the same party in control of the White House and both chambers of Congress. And so that provides a lot more opportunities to advance their policies than otherwise would be the case if there were a divided Congress. There are several levels of policy making, some of which are a lot easier to accomplish, some of which more difficult. So sort of administrative actions, things that the White House can just do on its own. That is probably the easiest lift, right? It can be done almost immediately. Then there's regulatory changes. So that's the process that federal agencies undertake. I think you're probably well familiar or have heard of public comment opportunities on proposed regulations. The regulations are basically the rules for how an agency is going to implement a particular law that's on the books, right? So it's an important tool around implementation. So agencies can change regulations, right? So agencies can change all the regulations that were created by the Biden administration, but it's a process that takes time, has to follow legal procedures that are set forth in law. So it can take a year, it can take even 2 years to change a regulation. So that takes some time. And those changes can sometimes be challenged in court when the final regulation is issued. And then lastly, there's legislative, right? So actually changing laws, and that requires Congress to take action. And that's cumbersome. It can be difficult even when one party controls the majority in both chambers, because in the Senate, there's this thing called the filibuster, which means that to pass most legislation, you need a supermajority of 60 votes in the Senate. And as you saw earlier, as I shared, the highest sort of number of senators that Republicans can hope for is 53, which means they're going to need at least 7 Democrats to pass any legislation. So that's going to mean that they're going to have to compromise on a lot of their legislative priorities. There's going to be one big exception to that, which is, and you're probably going to hear a lot about this in the coming months, is the budget reconciliation process. This is a process that can be used to go around the filibuster, so things can pass through the Senate based on a simple majority vote. But you can't pass just anything. There's some strict rules around what can be included in legislation that goes through budget reconciliation. You can also only pass one such bill per budget year. And so there are some limitations on that. And we'll talk more about how that applies to different policy issues in a moment. But I just wanted to be sure to lay that all out. So let's now bring up the slides, and we'll start with the policy impacts that we see coming. So first of all, when it comes to health, I think there are a number of areas where we can see some changes. First of all, just say, we know that during the first Trump administration, there was an attempt to repeal the Affordable Care Act, and they tried to use the budget reconciliation process for that. But there wasn't even majority support among Republican senators for repealing the Affordable Care Act. And so, they got pretty burned by that. And even though there has been some talk about trying to do that again, the House Republican Speaker has said, no, that's not really on the agenda, and they're not going to try to pursue it. So I don't think we're going to see an attempt to repeal it, but we are going to see probably some efforts to chip away at it. In particular, an important sort of aspect of the Affordable Care Act was the Medicaid expansion, right? Expanding Medicaid to cover more people. And so we can certainly see some changes, while not completely removing it. We could see some changes using the budget reconciliation process, for example, to reduce the amount of money that California gets and that other states get in order to pay for the expansion of Medicaid. So that could have a severe budgetary impact on California and really plunge the state into some really difficult decisions around Medicaid coverage. You could also see efforts to just limit the range of benefits that folks enrolled in Medicaid, or Medi-Cal, as we know it in California, are able to access. And then I'll just say, with reproductive health, even though there are members of the president's party who want a national ban on abortion, the president said that he would not support that. It's unlikely that that could even pass through Congress, again, because of the filibuster. But there are a lot of things that can be done to chip away at reproductive rights, particularly the right to abortion. So we could see restrictions on the availability of mifepristone, for example. We could see the expansion of giving healthcare providers the ability to refuse to provide abortion-related care, and restrictions on various clinics in the community in terms of reproductive health services that they provide. In the public health space, President Trump has said that he would give Robert F. Kennedy Jr. A lot of leeway in determining public health policies in the U.S. It's unlikely that he'll be named Secretary of HHS. There's a lot of speculation, I say assumptions, that Robert Kennedy wouldn't even be able to pass the security background check needed for that. But he could still have an advisory role, kind of like a public health czar role within the White House, and have the ear of the president, which could really impact public health policies. As you know, he's very skeptical about vaccines, so we could see a rollback in vaccine policies at the federal level, and even restricting fluoridation of water, something that I think many of us thought was a settled issue a long time ago. Let's move on to the next issue, which is immigration. Look, this was obviously a very high-profile issue for the incoming president. Has a very ambitious agenda to roll back a lot of existing protections for immigrants, whether that's DACA, temporary protected status, humanitarian parole, to engage in widespread interior enforcement, deportation, deputizing federal agents, National Guard, in order to engage in these efforts to increase enforcement and deportation, restricting people from coming into the country, and then revising various regulations. We'll see probably a new public charge rule, increases in fees for visas, naturalization applications, et cetera, and the ability for those with DACA to access the Affordable Care Act, which is just becoming available now. So it's possible that might be a short-lived thing just for 1 year. There will be efforts to mitigate a lot of this, either through legal action. You're going to see a lot of, I would imagine, employers pushing back on the idea of losing a lot of the immigrant workforce that they rely on. This is going to be a protracted sort of battle, I think, in the courts and in other fora as well. Next one on environment. Let me wrap up here quickly. I think you're going to see certainly attacks on any environmental justice programs. I would expect within the first week of the administration that the Justice 40 initiative, which was an initiative started by the Biden administration to make sure that at least 40% of the benefits of federal climate and energy investments support disadvantaged communities, that initiative will be scrapped right away. I think there's going to be efforts to curtail environmental justice grant making. On energy and climate change, there's been talk about repealing the clean energy and climate programs in the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a landmark piece of legislation passed during the Biden administration. They probably won't completely repeal it, but they will chip away at it. They'll probably repeal a lot of the environmental justice and certain greenhouse gas reduction programs. Some tax incentives for clean energy might stay in place because those are actually creating jobs and investment in many parts of the country. And I think members of Congress from both parties aren't going to want to see that go away. And then lastly, real quickly, we're going to see impacts on housing. There's going to be a shift to more of a giving greater flexibility to landlords. So we're probably going to see a weakening of fair housing regulations. There are likely to be in the reconciliation process some tax incentives for first-time home buyers. when it comes to LGBT equality, I think you're going to see the removal of non-discrimination protections for LGBTQ people across a range of federal grant programs and other civil rights protection, particularly in healthcare, but also in the school setting, job training, and housing as well. I'm going to just wrap up there. Happy to take any questions on some of the other policy impacts during the Q&A. And with that, let me turn it over to Marvin to walk us through some of the state level changes.
Thank you, Michael. I appreciate that. So I'll just wait here for the PowerPoint presentation to show, and then I'll go ahead and get started. So thank you. I'm Marvin Pineda with California Advocacy. Thank you, everyone, for being here. And as the two previous speakers have mentioned, there's a lot of change still going on with some of these elections that I will be covering. Next slide, please. So I will be providing an overview of the Assembly, Senate races, and the ballot initiatives. I will focus on some of the initiatives. And just for background purposes, county election officials must report final results for all contests by December 6th. So that's almost a month away. They're still counting votes, as mentioned by the previous speaker. The Secretary of State has to certify the results by December 13th, which is in about 36 days. And there's a question that was submitted: when do the ballot initiatives take effect? It's 5 days after the Secretary of State certifies the results. So ballot initiatives that pass would take effect December 18th. As I get into the races, we have, I'll start off with the Assembly. And we know that the Assembly and the Senate both have supermajorities. There's been supermajority since 2012. In this election, 36 of 120 lawmakers, as Assembly and Senators, termed out or decided not to finish their 12 years and left early or moved on to the Senate. As we know, the supermajority allows Democrats to raise taxes or put initiatives on the ballot without a Republican support, which is why we saw some of the initiatives placed on the ballot by the legislature. Next slide, please. So I'll start off with the Senate. 40 senators and 31 Democrats, 40 senators, 31 Democrats, 9 Republicans. Half of the Senate seats were up for re-election. So we saw that some senators were running in newly redistricted seats. So that means some of this Senate seats took 2 years to catch up with redistricting. So that's why you saw some senators running in a completely new area that they haven't served. We had one Republican versus Republican election, 3 Democrats versus Democrat elections, and of course there was a lot of there were senators that were running that were not being challenged, or if they were challenged, they were running against an opponent that was likely not to win because of the voter registration in favor of them. 3 races that could have impacted the Senate. One is in District 19. Senator Choa Bogue was challenged by a Democrat. She retained her seat. What came to a surprise for everyone is in District 37, Democrat Josh Newman was challenged by Republican Steve Choi, and now Senator Newman is behind in that seat. If they lose this seat, Democrats will go down to 30 Democrats, which give a +1 to Republicans. In Senate District 23, Republican Martinez Valladares defeated Democrat Mueller. So the Republicans, again, looks like they're going to be picking up a seat here in the Senate. But again, votes are still being counted, so it's too close to call for the Newman race. Next slide, please. In the Assembly, 80 Assembly members, currently made up of 62 Democrats, 18 Republicans. For background purposes, every assembly member runs for re-election every 2 years. Republicans needed to win 9 seats held by Democrats to break that Democratic supermajority, which did not happen. What we did see is that we had 5 Republican versus Republican elections, 8 Democrat versus Democrat elections. When we have this Dem versus Dem election, you see moderates supported by business and liberal or more progressive candidates supported by labor unions. Races they could have changed. They could change the partisan makeup, as again votes are still being counted. In District 40, incumbent Democrat Chavo is defeating her challenger, Republican Gibson. In District 47, incumbent Republican Wallace is defeating the Democrat challenger. Again, too close to call. In District 47, incumbent Republican Lori Davis defeated the Democrat challenger. I think the Democrats thought that they had a better shot at defeating Davies in that seat. 2 seats, again, this is where sometimes elections are so unpredictable that in District 36, this seat was held by Assemblymember Eduardo Garcia, but he left 2 years early. The Democrat is losing to the Republican challenger. Here, Democrats have a larger voter registration, but again, they're losing and it's too close to call. In District 58, Clarissa Cervantes is losing to the Republicans. This is in Riverside, too close to call. This, again, is the seat that Democrats should be winning. So if Republicans are able to win 2 of these races, it'll be +2. And it looks like they may get a few seats here. Next slide. So this slide, as I had posted in this morning, was that these new legislators were going to have to come in and deal with the budget deficit, crime, homelessness, climate change, healthcare, and other policies as workforce. Then the governor this morning has called for a special session that begins December 2nd, when all these new legislators and those re-elected legislators get sworn in. And the special session will focus to protect California values, including fundamental civil rights, reproductive freedom, climate action, immigrant families, and others. So this is in response to what Michael was mentioning, that the new federal administration may be looking into. So it's a response to that. And according to Governor Newsom, this is the first of several actions by the Newsom administration and partnering with the legislature to tackle this new challenge. The special session that Governor Newsom has called is to fund the Attorney General and state agencies. And the Attorney General is being funded to sue the federal administration and to defend against the federal administration. So this December 2nd legislation, we could see a number of bills that could be enacted also that California and the governor and legislature think that needs to be done. So a lot going on here. So a lot more ideas are going to be produced, and potentially we will see in legislation early December 2nd. So a lot of stuff going on. I like to, next slide, please. The 10 ballot initiatives, I know one of the previous speakers focused on this, so I won't spend too much time. We've seen that the ballot initiatives are a result of agreements, disagreements among stakeholders, the governor's office, and the legislature. Again, as I mentioned previously, these ballot initiatives that are approved take effect 5 days after the Secretary of State certifies the elections. Tuesday's results show that voters are willing to go along with the party's progressive views on climate change, abortion rights, civil rights, and healthcare policy, but not on others, right? We saw a deviation on crime, rent control, and minimum wage as those initiatives were defeated. Next slide, please. So again, these were the initiatives that were approved. I'll focus on a few of those. Proposition 2, which authorized $10 billion in bonds to modernize and repair public schools and community colleges. This was not, the poll showed that it was not going to be approved, and we see that it got approved. Prop 3, the previous speaker covered. Prop 4, that's another big win for, let's say, environmental groups and for the workforce too. Prop 4 authorizes $10 billion for water projects, wildfire prevention, extreme heat projects. It has offshore wind funding in there. It has money to weatherize farm workers' homes in there. It's everybody called it a Christmas tree, and it did become a Christmas tree because there's a lot of projects that are going to benefit a lot of low-income communities there. Prop 35, which I will go into more detail in the later slide. That's making the managed care organization tax permanent to fund Medi-Cal. Prop 36, right? Prop 36 is got approved by the voters overwhelmingly. So Prop 36, what it does is it offers an offender with 2 prior convictions for theft could be charged with a felony, regardless of the value of the merchandise, meaning that a judge retains the discretion whether they want to reduce it to a misdemeanor or not. It would also allow prosecutors to charge a theft of $950 or less as a felony for offenders who had 2 or more previous theft-related convictions. Again, I will cover those more in the next slide. Next slide, please. Propositions that failed. Prop 5, again, a lot of groups were looking at this because passing bonds at the local level with the 55% voter approval is a lot easier than the higher threshold currently. Again, that unfortunately did not happen. It's a big blow to potentially build affordable housing for those in need. Prop 6, this is, I think, a surprise for a lot of folks. This is a measure that would have prohibited any type of slavery and would have prohibited the Department of Corrections from disciplining any person that's incarcerating for refusing to a work assignment. Again, I will cover more of this here as I will talk about the reparations package shortly. Prop 32, again, the minimum wage, that did not pass. Rent control, Prop 33, also was defeated. Next slide, please. So I would just talk about some of the impact of these initiatives that were approved or were not approved. So Prop 2, again, $10 billion to repair K-12 schools and community colleges. What we'll see is schools and community colleges will be modernized. A lot of the classrooms are in need of infrastructure repairs for different reasons, whether it's air conditioning, whether it is weatherization. So big win for, I think, students, teachers for this $10 billion. Prop 4, again, $10 billion for climate change. Big win for labor unions and environmental groups as they will be able to make some significant investments in some areas that are heavily impacted by pollution, bad water, or risk of fires, that projects can be built to help with those issues. Again, Prop 5, I've talked about. It's unfortunate. A lot of folks were looking at this to build housing, as we've seen our homeless population has increased substantially. I think this is probably an initiative that comes back in the future. This is an initiative that was passed by the legislature, so it did not require substantial funding for signature gathering. Prop 6, I mentioned earlier, this was an initiative that was part of the Reparations Task Force recommendations, and it was a priority for legislators. The statement that the Black Caucus has made in legislation that has not been approved in the past is that they will continue to push for some of these bills. I have not seen a statement on Prop 36 from the Black Caucus, but other legislative priorities that are part of the Reparations Task Force will be reintroduced this coming year. I want to talk about Prop 35, right? This was an initiative that divided some groups. As we know, it makes MCO tax permanent. There was some opposition by some organizations because it limits the flexibility for the legislature to spend the MCO tax. And because the initiative did not respect a budget agreement that allowed for continuous funding for Medi-Cal for children 0 to 5 years old. This is where Michael talked about Medi-Cal now being in the hands of the federal government. Prop 35 requires for the federal government to approve this type of expansion for Medi-Cal. Prop 36, as I mentioned, unfortunately, this will lead to more folks being incarcerated, potentially low-income individuals. Again, this is an impact on communities, low-income communities. There will be an impact to fiscal impact to state governments, local governments, as we will see more folks being incarcerated. This was sponsored by the California District Attorneys Association. And I think for them, it would be a big win as they've been arguing with the legislature for over a year on how to address retail theft, and they were not able to reach a solution. Next slide, please. 2026 will bring us several elections, including the California governor, lieutenant governor, and others. So we will see a lot of movement there. And this new governor will have to deal with 2 years under a newly elected president. Next slide, please. So thank you, everyone. That's all what I have. I appreciate your time, and I will pass it back on to Marisol.
Thank you so much, Marvin. And thanks, Michael and Mindy. I want to bring everyone back on screen. Those were very, very sobering, very just good information for us to have as we continue, to move ahead. And so we do have one question in the chat that I was hoping we could get to. I know we're almost at time, but it's a question for Mindy. And it says that data didn't include the evangelical or how faith may have caused a shift. Is it difficult to capture that data?
We do have currently exit poll data that does have breakout by religion. I did note earlier, we don't have exit polls this election for California, although they are often problematic for voters of color and young people. But that's why I didn't show you exit poll data for California. The national level, it looks like Trump did gain some ground among religious voters, both Catholics and Protestants and evangelicals. But we're still learning about this data. And then beyond exit polls, actual research, we're going to have to wait to see what those results actually bring us.
Got it. Thank you so much for that. And I know, like I said, we're out of time, but this was just a really great informational session. We will share all the slide decks with our audience after the webinar. I want to give my appreciations to Marvin, Mindy, and Michael for your time today, and just for the work that you're doing. We are just very grateful for you to serve as a resource today to help us understand, what the results of the election mean for all of us. So thank you so much. I want to remind our audience that we really welcome your feedback, and there will be a survey for you at the very end. And I also want to direct you to the endowment's post-election statement that we issued yesterday. And before we close, I did want to just read a little quote from there. And it says, "We are deeply inspired by our grantee partners' courage and vision for a just and inclusive California. California has made tremendous progress toward racial equity and health equity over the last few decades, due in large part to the collective effort and building community power. And so to our partners and, those that are, marginalized and maybe targeted, just have full faith that we will continue to walk this path with you all. So thank you again so much to our speakers, to our audience. and look for an email in your inboxes tomorrow. We hope to see you back for the 2025 season of Policy Perspectives. Have a good day, and this will conclude our program. Thank you so much.
Thank you.